Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Schniter. He is lecturer in anthropology at California State University, Fullerton, and visiting research associate at the Economic Science Institute at Chapman University. Dr. Schniter does research in evolutionary anthropology, behavioral economics, and evolutionary psychology. And today we're going to talk about some of the topics he covers in his work. So, Dr. Schniter, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's an honor.
So let's start perhaps with some of your anthropological work. So I know that you study how skill, knowledge, and material production develop across the lifespan. So could you tell us about that? I mean, how does it occur exactly?
Yeah, sure. So most of the work that I've done on this topic of skill knowledge and material production across the lifespan has been done with the Chimane, Native American forager farmers of the Bolivian Amazon. And so for my dissertation research, I collaborated with a team of Chimane research assistants, and in collaboration with them, we developed a list of 92 essential skills that are important for the Chimane way of life. They cover a wide variety of things like food production, craft production, chores, childcare, reproduction skills, music, storytelling, and more. And so we use that list of essential skills as part of a skills survey, interviewing 421 people ages 15 through 86, asking them if they had each of those gender appropriate skills in the list. And if they said that they did, then we had follow-up questions. We asked them, what age did you acquire the skill at? How proficient are you with this skill? Who do you know to be most expert with this skill? And who influenced your learning and the kind of components of that, like instruction, correction, example, encouragement, discouragement that we asked about. And what we learned from this survey was that most of these skills were acquired by the age of reproduction, by the end of adolescence. And then they're developed further throughout adulthood to meet the needs of the demands and needs of the growing family. And then as people get into their post-reproductive years, they're typically kind of going past their ages of peak material production or food production and maybe other types of peak performance, but they continue to indicate that they're developing more conceptual and procedural proficiency, more careful knowledge with the skills. And so even though they have less strength, less dexterity than younger adults, most people, there's consensual agreement that they're really the most expert with most of these skills, but especially the difficult skills that don't require a lot of strength. Among those, like music and storytelling, are often kind of associated with older adult expertise. And this kind of late age of expertise and great knowledge among older adults is consistent with the role as providers and educators.
Mhm. So, but in this case, when we're talking about older adults, do they contribute, for example, with their knowledge or any other thing to the long lifespans of humans?
Okay, so that's a big, deep, good evolutionary biology question. And maybe another way I could kind of reframe that question, but
Okay.
it would be like, is there positive selection on older adult survival because of a contribution that maybe they're making to the survival of others at younger ages? And is how has it affected the evolution of the human lifespan? So we know that selection on survival throughout reproductive years is certainly strong, and people maintain healthy bodies up until the end of reproduction generally. But after reproduction, we see that our body's ability to maintain itself and repair itself declines, and we really senesce at a faster rate. So it looks like selection's stronger on reproductive ages and much weaker on post-reproductive ages. But people still manage to live, even in like the Chimane who live in a highly infectious environment. People who survive to the end of reproduction often survive a couple decades after, often, to the age of 70 even. So what about their contributions, right? The older adults, I would say they're certainly not zero. There's something going on there. And recently there's this paper that came out in 2022 in PNAS by Davison and Gervin. It's called The Importance of Elders and Extending Hamilton's Force of Selection to Include Intergenerational Transfers. They model the surplus production of older adults in that paper and show that its contribution to kin, to younger generations, is sufficient to create a positive selection for older age survival, which would mean that's contributing to the longer human lifespan. So ethnographically, we know that in some societies, yes, older adults help support younger dependents. And my work with the Chimane Health and Life History Project, has been showing more evidence for those sorts of contributions. One kind of evidence is food production. That's actually, as I maybe mentioned before, it peaks with the reproductive adults, but it stays pretty good in the years after the reproductive ages. So there's still some contributions of food production in post-reproductive ages. But as older adults start to not be as productive as their juniors within a multi-generational family, they seem to shift their efforts to other kinds of contributions, like low-strength services that they can perform well in, so childcare, storytelling, musical performance, things like that. And another thing is that older adults are occasionally what I might call lifelines. Some responses we got from adult Chimane informants in interviews told us that about 1 out of 5 people report that they lost a parent before the age of 18, and when they did, they were cared for by grandparents or older aunts and uncles. So older adults certainly can make huge impacts on fitness occasionally, right? But I also want to be cautious with these generalizations about the contributions of older adults, because it's true that not all older adults are great helpers and educators, and we see substantial variation with the Chimane. In fact, with John Stieglitz, we have a paper on depression in older ages that shows that some older adults definitely report depression symptoms, and it's the ones who are having more disability, meaning they can make less contributions, and also who experience more social conflict. And then also ethnographically, we know that not all foraging societies have supporting adults and support the older adults. There's cases in the ethnographic record about gericide, the killing of older adults intentionally. And we see that with the foraging societies that have more difficult subsistence challenges.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, these aspects that you studied in the Chimane, have they been studied in other human societies? Have they been cross-culturally validated? I mean, things related to skill, knowledge, material production.
Yes, there is ongoing work with other forager groups about the acquisition, development of skills, and there's been work with other groups looking at the impact of grandparents on survival and so on. But I'd say a large amount of the work has been done by my colleagues and I with the Chimane Health and Life History Project, because we're such a big project and it's been ongoing for, it's probably getting on 20 years now.
Yeah. What is ethnobiological knowledge specifically?
Right, so ethnobiological knowledge is the practical knowledge about local ecology associated with a group of people. And so the way that people interact with their local ecology is going to affect what they might know about plants and animals and their potential benefits, uses, dangers, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I've been interested in this topic to try to kind of understand how people do interact with their environment and make a living. And I asked a few questions that relate to ethnobiological knowledge with the Chimane skills survey, like if they knew about medicinal plants, where was an ideal place to plant a garden, or do they know the habits of wild animals and where to find them. But most of my work on this topic has been done with the Mexican Choyeros. They're a group of off-grid ranchers in the Sierra de la Giganta mountains of Baja California Sur. So with them, I asked people in the ages 5 to 86 years old to look at these images I had on my laptop of 87 local plants and 50 local animals, and to try to tell me if they could identify them, and if so, what they thought they were called, what they were named.
Mm-hmm. Does this knowledge or any kind of knowledge you studied relate in any way to life history theory and the timing of productivity and reproduction?
Yeah, definitely. So life history theory is concerned with understanding how species development and reproduction strategies across the lifespan have been selected for. And in a comparative perspective, we know that there's a wide range of life history strategies. Some species have really slow lifespans, others have really fast lifespans. Now, humans are exceptionally slow, and we have this really long period of dependency in childhood where there's a lot of investment and support from older generations. So that's kind of exceptional in the comparative perspective. According to the embodied capital model of human life history strategy, there's been extreme investments in cognitive capital that have led to a human life history pattern that has this long dependent childhood, which is the time when kids are programming that cognitive capital. They're learning things, they're developing their skills and knowledge. And it's during this long, it's basically like 18 years, even in modern societies, right? When these children and adolescents are supported in foraging societies by 3-generational extended family that they're kind of situated within, and there's net downward flows of resources and knowledge to support that childhood. So ethnobiological knowledge helps parents be productive in that role. And as parents' productivity increases throughout the reproductive years to meet the growing demands of their growing families, their knowledge, their ethnobiological knowledge especially, will also increase. With the Choyeros, what we found about the development of ethnobiological knowledge is that by childhood, most of the dangerous plants and animals and food items were known. So it's really after reaching adulthood that then people start to fill in the other gaps and learn about the other kinds of plants and animals. This prioritization of learning about dangerous things is also consistent with work by Annie Wirtz, who shows that children, even infants at very young ages, we are attentive to cues about dangerous plants. And so no surprise that, with the Choyeros, they're learning these things at young ages. And then the post-reproductive adults with the Choyeros, they showed the greatest ethnobiological knowledge, though there was a lot of variance and heterogeneity among older adults. So if you looked at who the top 10% of most knowledgeable people were, they were definitely post-reproductive older adults. But among all the older adults, there were also some that scored quite low. And in the case of those, it was pretty much like vision problems, mobility problems. They're having trouble interacting with the stimulus. And probably they were interacting with their local environment less due to the states that they were in as well.
Also, I guess that also happens with older adults in forager societies, but there's probably also some cognitive decline with age, right?
Yes, there is. Mm-hmm. Right. All the systems senesce, cognitive, physical, and so it gets in the way of productivity. It gets in the way of knowledge transfer. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any sex differences when it comes to knowledge acquisition and specialization?
Um, so I can address this kind of in three parts.
Okay.
There's sex differences in the timing of acquisition I can talk about, and sex differences in the content that they specialize in, and then sex differences maybe in who they learn from. So in
Okay.
the timing of acquisition, my work with the Chimane shows that it's actually quite similar for the acquisition of skills when they're coming online. It's similar for males and females, so there's not really any sex differences there. They're very small, if any. Females reach sexual maturity a couple of years earlier, and you also see like the acquisition of food production, childcare skills that comes online for females a couple of years earlier too. By the age of 30, males have caught up with females in pretty much acquiring all the skills. Um, there's differences in specialization, certainly. The content of the knowledge and skills acquired by Chimane males and females is different sometimes. And this would be expected, right? Because any group's subsistence system and social organization kind of sets up these sociological interaction opportunities where they can engage in behavior, they can get culture transmitted to them. So if there's a gender divided world that they're living in part of the time, that's going to affect what they're learning. Foragers typically have gender divided labor and socialization. And so we see that this is affecting what people are learning. With the 92 skills with the Chimane, about a quarter of them were female specific and about a quarter of them were male specific, and a little over half of them were either gender could engage with. And then in terms of who people are learning from, at least with the Chimane, there's a big same-sex pattern of learning. 73% of the transmitters that people were reporting they learned skills from were older kin of the same sex, basically.
Do you have any idea if these sex differences that you find in these forager societies stem from socialization? I mean, due to the fact that in these societies people might attribute gender roles to men and women.
There are certainly gender roles, right? I think the way that I think about it is in order to make a living, to support dependents in these foraging societies, there's practical ways that people have divided up some of the tasks. And, you know, I see people do this even in modern industrial societies, husbands and wives, you know, they'll come up with their own particular ways of dividing up mutual tasks. And this is done in these foraging societies as well. So there's going to be gender roles that emerge that are kind of normative within the societies, and surely there could be people for their own reasons want to go into the other gender roles, and there's times and situations when people violate perhaps these gender roles, but I think they really come more from a practical rationale rather than some sort of arbitrary cultural normative rationale.
Yeah, I was also just trying to understand if there's more evidence to support the some sort of innateness to these sex differences, or if they're mostly the result of socialization. Do you know that?
Well, back to the kind of practical reasons for them. There's strength differences. There's obligate costs of reproduction that really make the comparative advantages to engage in different tasks different for males and females. And so that would, yes, those are innate reasons, right?
Right. So you've studied also storytelling. So is this also a skill that people in general in these foraging societies acquire, and where are its functions?
Right. So the function of storytelling is basically to transmit some kind of information that the storyteller assumes is useful, and to reinforce codes of conduct. In small-scale societies like the Chimane, you'll see that there's at least two kinds of storytelling. There's informal storytelling and traditional storytelling. And informal storytelling is telling about personal anecdotes, experiences. It could be retelling your dreams, or maybe telling someone else's experiences that you've heard about, this kind of exchange of information. The traditional storytelling is a narrative tradition, and it's drawing on these traditional stories that have been passed on for generations after generation. And those kind of stories tend to communicate important information about important locations in the local ecology, or hazards, subsistence information, morality, mythology, norms, marriage, how people maintain other kinds of relationships. And traditional storytellers will also blend in their own personal experiences and anecdotes. If an older adult, let's say, is telling a traditional story and there's some animals in it, maybe they'll use some sounds or tell about some of their encounters with these animals. And as far as the timing that you were asking about, with the Chimane, we see that oral tradition skills, and storytelling is one of these. Music is also another kind of oral tradition skill. These are acquired the latest of these different kind of groups of skills that I've looked at. So food production's around 16, chores and crafts 17, childcare around 18, but storytelling skills seem to come online a little later, like by 21 years old. And so it's at 21 years old that the Chimane are telling me that they're basically now able to tell a story and have begun to kind of engage in that practice. But it's really not until people get in those post-reproductive years that they're considered to be the most expert. And when you see like a big group of people gathered at in someone's house in the evening around a fire, it's often the older adult there who's taking the role as a storytelling. So the expert storytellers from our research are about 65 to 86 years old. It's one of the oldest kind of brackets of expertise that we identified.
So these older experts are the ones that usually tell the stories, or is it that everyone tells stories at any age, or at least from the point they acquire the skills, or how does it work exactly?
Yeah, I think people are often engaging, maybe interpersonally, one-on-one, mothers with their kids, fathers with their kids, telling stories. But sometimes there's these more larger kind of public settings, and then the privilege goes to the more experienced storytelling.
Okay. So let's get now a little bit more into your work in behavioral economics. So, how are human relationships maintained? I mean, what would you say are some of the main ingredients or elements there?
Right. So relationships are based on interaction, kind of by definition, and relationship quality can deteriorate, and people can stop wanting to interact with each other. So if we're talking about maintaining a relationship, or a relationship that is maintained, it's one that continues to have interactions and expectations of future interactions. So to maintain relationships, like trust-based relationships, people will communicate with one another to assure each other of their intentions. They'll try to repair problems that have come up, or adjust how people are thinking about them and valuing them. And so people will maintain cooperative relationships, and sometimes people also try to maintain exploitative relationships, right? But in either case, they're going to do this expressing emotions, communicating information, and with different kinds of behaviors that affect how others value them.
But I mean, what gives rise to trust in human relationships?
Well, good question. So trust is something that I think could be described in two ways. People describe what they call generalized trust, and then they describe strategic trust. And generalized trust is this idea of kind of how you think about strangers in general, or you think about someone you're unacquainted with. How much might you be able to trust them? But the strategic trust is more about how, when you know something about someone and you have a relationship with them, how do you develop that trust? And what trust is an attitude or a belief about how that other person's going to behave in their interaction with you, whether they'll act trustworthy, which means that they won't exploit you, they won't take advantage of you. Yeah.
So, what is the relationship between things like promises and apologies and the building and rebuilding of trust?
Okay, so people regularly use verbal promises to build trust and to assure their exchange partners that they can be relied upon. But it's kind of interesting that this can even work in the first place, right? So as people say, talk is cheap, or another kind of saying, people can promise you the moon, but who's gonna actually deliver that? Why is it that this works? That's a good question. And similarly, apologies are used when people realize that they've acted selfishly or harmed another, and they want to rebuild that victim's trust. But again, why should apologies be trusted, right? You have evidence that the person harmed you, and now they're saying that they won't. So why does cheap talk work in the first place? It's something that I've been curious to study, and so I've used some trust games to study this. I have one study I've done with Roman Cherameta and Daniel Schniter that uses a one-way communication stage in a trust game, and it allows the second player to start by saying to the first player, if you invest in me, I promise to return to you a certain amount of money. The way that trust game worked was there were two players paired with each other, interacting anonymously. They didn't know who the other was. There's a player one and a player two. And so after that non-binding promise was made to the player one chose to either invest. They had an endowment of $5 that the experimenter gave them, and they could either invest it, and then player two would get $20, and they could choose to return any amount and keep any amount. Or if player one didn't want to invest the $5, they just keep that $5, and player two gets nothing. So that design. There's another cool feature of this experiment. So we let them play the game. We described that game as I just did. We let them play it, and then we surprised them, and we said, there's a second game we're going to let you play with the same person that you interacted with before. And they weren't expecting that second game. And so we told them also, before the second game, the second mover can send a message. There's a chat box, and they could write anything. We said, don't use profanities, but you can write anything. And they could send a message. And so we were curious, with this design, would we see some kind of endogenous emergence of apologies among trust breakers? Would we see people upregulating their promise or changing their promise the second time around to try to encourage people who didn't trust them the first time around? And what we found was in the first game, about a fifth of people who were trusted, or let's say a fifth of people were promise breakers. So they were trusted and broke their promises, and a fifth of people were not trusted. So what we found was that the promise breakers, they used apologies. We didn't suggest you can apologize. It was just a blank chat box, but they used apologies, and they used long messages too. Actually, the ones who weren't trusted used even longer messages. They put a lot of effort into trying to convince the person to trust them. And in both cases, we saw people, the promise breakers, if they offered low promises, those promises went up towards an equal split. and the ones who weren't trusted, their promises went up relative to what they offered before. And overall, it seems like this messaging worked because the games paid off for both investors and trustees. And we see that where apologies were issued, people tended to retrust. Another interesting thing, though, is that so the extent of that broken promise, the bigger the difference between what you promise and what you actually followed through with. If there was a big lie there, then you could apologize all you want and you wouldn't be retrusted, right? So apologies were accepted conditional on how big that lie was or how big the economic impact of the lie was.
Yeah. What about confession? Is that something that people also tend to do, and what role does it serve?
Yeah, so similar to the promises and the apologies, which are kind of strange on the surface. Why should they work? Confession's a really strange communication phenomenon, where a confessor who hasn't yet been discovered as a harm doer or a trust breaker voluntarily provides their victim with information about the harm they've caused them, and this should in the mind, in the eyes of the victim, it should devalue that confessor. So why would anybody do that, right? Why would anyone make themselves out to be worse than they're known to be? So I've thought about this and have a study with Daniel Schniter and John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, and we thought that the answer would be that when people voluntarily and spontaneously confess, that it's done as a preemptive strategy to really minimize future costs. Obviously, there's going to be some costs to revealing your wrongdoings, but you might be helping yourself out in the more long-term horizon. So if one expects that their offense will eventually be discovered, and you think that maybe the victim might value learning about the harm that was done sooner than later, it would be better to reveal that, to confess to them about the harm you've done rather than waiting till they discover it, and then also, compounded is the fact that you were keeping this thing secret, which is one more point against you if that's what you've chosen to do. So we collected, in a study, we collected natural offenses that people could tell us about where they chose to confess. And we also designed some vignette studies that we manipulated experimentally to test this kind of prediction about confession. And what we found was that offenders are more willing to confess when the benefit of the offense to the offender is high and when the cost to the victim is low, and when that probability of the information leaking and the offender being discovered is high. So the result suggests that there's a conflict of interest between people, and that there's a strategic awareness of these different perspectives of interest on the part of the confessors.
Would one of the reasons for why apologies and confessions, at least to some extent, work, be related to the fact that if you're apologizing for or confessing something you've done, you're also communicating that you care about the social norms that are being violated?
Yes. So there's emotions that I didn't mention that were revealed by our participants in these studies. And it turns out that those, let's say in the promises and apologies study, those who were promise breakers, they tended to report guilt and shame on an emotional survey after the game and before the second game that we surprised them with. And so those who reported more guilt and shame were more likely to produce apologies, were more likely to produce longer messages. And so with what you're asking, in our interpersonal interactions, there's all kinds of messages that are communicated, and talk is cheap, but sometimes we see the emotions behind messages, right? And so we know if a message is more heartfelt, if it's got more emotion behind it, then if that emotion is appropriate to the kind of person that you want to work with, then that's kind of a reinforcement of the signal value of the talk, which is otherwise just totally cheap. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've started our conversation by talking about things like knowledge acquisition and material production.
Right.
Does it relate to, in any way, to relationship maintenance?
Yeah, so the tie between these kind of two topics that I've been interested are that material and knowledge transfers often entail costs and potential benefits to those who are making the transfers. And they might get benefits in return from making those transfers. And so a lot of, like in the small scale foraging societies, we see that a lot of the transfers of both material and knowledge are going downwards from older to younger generations. And some of the benefits there are that there's inclusive fitness benefits for those older generations who are helping the younger. But there also might be some really long-term delayed reciprocity. If I am teaching my children something now, maybe in my oldest ages, when they've become really productive, they'll be helping me out in return too, right? So those kinds of costs and benefit relationships help us understand the relationships and the transfers among kin, but among non-kin, there's going to be even more challenge because there's less mutual interests aligned around fitness. And so the exchanges of resource and information there will require maintenance. But even in families, people have trouble and conflict, and if you're not getting along with your family members, there's not going to be any flow of knowledge and resources. So we need to monitor costs and benefits and our exchange partners' intentions, and we need to try to influence our exchange partners thinking about how they value us. And this is all part of relationship maintenance, and that's kind of, I think, how it would apply to these transfers of material resources and knowledge in small-scale societies and modern societies everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, even talking about the family, there's also parent-offspring conflict, right? Even when there's strong genetic relatedness, it's not the case that the interests are always aligned, right?
Right, and so that's those are touchy, like weaning conflict or something like that. A mother will have to work hard to keep the baby happy because of the conflict that's ongoing, right? That's another a particular case of relationship maintenance. But yeah, I agree. It's omnipresent in all kinds of relationships.
So a minute ago, when we were talking about apologies and confessions and the emotions associated with them, like guilt and shame, we were relating it to building and rebuilding trust. Are there any other emotions associated with trust?
Yeah, there's so many, I'm sure. So, like the English language, I've seen reported has like over 3,000 words for emotions. And I'm sure among that set, there's got to be a really long list that one could argue pertain to trust-based relationships. An emotion is an adaptation functionally designed to orchestrate our physiological and cognitive systems so that we behave in certain ways to address adaptive problems. And so the trust game is a social dilemma which has adaptive problems kind of built into it, and it has allowed us to look for the triggering of specific emotions, by particular outcomes. So I could give you a couple other examples. Like gratitude is an emotion that might be triggered after someone has benefited you. And so it might motivate the person feeling gratitude to acknowledge that they've received the benefit, that they appreciate the help, and to signal to the helper that they value them. So that would be kind of an interpersonal social emotion. Anger would be kind of the flip side of that. If someone hasn't helped you and You would want to communicate that to them and hopefully change their perspective of how they're undervaluing you. And so the trust game, it's a decision dilemma, a social dilemma that has long-term trust-based cooperative exchange goals, and it also has these short-term selfish goals that are kind of in conflict. And so people also, when they play this game and then they see how it turned out, they're often left with conflicted or mixed emotions as well. So that means having some kind of positive emotion and some kind of negative emotion simultaneously experienced. So like imagine someone who is a truster or an investor in the trust game, and they have a resource and they can entrust it to the second player, which would certainly help the second player. But if they do that and the second player doesn't return anything to them, they might, for example, feel angry pride. Anger, as I mentioned, because they've been harmed through this, but they might be proud that they've done something cooperative. They've demonstrated themselves to be this good person. And so we certainly have participants, it was a result that are experiencing angry pride in that situation. Or in that same situation, the trustee who's gotten this transfer was trusted, and now they've returned nothing and they've kept it all. They might be happy and guilty at the same time. So it's some kind of happy guiltiness, and that's also something that we found. And a couple other of our studies with trust games also have revealed some interesting results with emotions. There's another one that I ran with Timothy Shields and Daniel Schniter that has the classic human-human trust game, but it also has two other versions of trust games. One's a human-robot trust game, and another one's a human-robot trust game where there's a passive human recipient. And so the way that these worked is that the robots in these games were mimicking humans. We first ran the human-human trust game. We had all of the behavior recorded of what the second players, the trustees, did. And then we had in the human-robot trust game, the robot basically would randomly pick from human behavior. So it was statistically identical, economically identical in how it would affect the investor. But it turns out that whether or not someone was playing with another human, or whether or not another human was impacted by the decisions, affected the emotions that people reported after the trust game. So social emotions like gratitude, anger, pride, and guilt, there was more activation of these emotions when a human was involved. People reported more gratitude or anger, depending, when they were paired with a human trustee. But when it was a robot who, let's say, screwed them over and sent nothing back, they might have been a little angry, but it wasn't equivalent to the level of anger they reported with a human. And likewise, if they invested and behaved nicely, transferring everything, and it turns out that it was human that they invested in, they would show more pride than if they were investing in a robot. That another interesting result, that it matters in our minds about how there's another agent and what their thinking is and how they will respond to emotions, whether we're even going to evoke these emotions in the first place.
So in that case of the robot, the kinds of responses people had to its behavior, was it because they didn't attribute agency to it? Is that it?
Right. So, I mean, that's how we interpret it. Certainly, people might get a little bit angry with inanimate objects, and maybe some of that anger is even like self-anger, self-directed anger, but it's kind of pointless to express a lot of anger, to feel a lot of anger, if it's not going to be functional, if it's not going to have an effect on a target.
Mm-hmm. So could you tell us about the recalibration perspective in the activation of emotions in trust-based interactions?
Sure thing. So the studies I've been telling you about show us that the experience and effects of emotion in the context of these trust-based interactions can be understood by considering the adaptive problems that are inherent in those interactions and by looking at the outcomes that people end up in. And so social dilemmas like the trust game feature the availability of mutually exclusive goals that the decision maker we expect is duly motivated to pursue. And so we're working with the idea that these dilemmas like the trust game activate some kind of psychic conflict between a short-sighted self-interest system and a long-sighted interest system that values a mutually beneficial cooperative relationship. And so, and added to this is also the uncertainty of what you're going to can expect of your partner. So when people are faced with these uncertain choice dilemmas, our modular minds have this kind of internal conflict, and emotions seem like they've co-evolved to help our sometimes conflicted minds to decide what to do. And so they basically help guide our behavior for future interactions. Some emotions upregulate systems and make us pursue that goal more, and other ones downregulate systems. And so in doing so, they adjust the relative balance of these conflicted or competing systems. And so that's the recalibrational role of emotions in behavior regulation. The promises and apology study I was telling you about, there we saw that those emotions that people reported after the first game predicted about 30% of the variation in the messaging and the trust re-extension behavior that was shown in the second game. So that's a lot of variance in behavior that's predicted by emotions. So based on that, I would say that emotions play a big role in regulating trust-based behavior.
So changing topics now, there's also dishonesty and mistrust. Are there sex differences in these domains?
Okay. Right. So there's a variety of literature that's looked at sex differences, and I think there's always a premium out there for literature that shows results, that shows differences. No one wants to read non-results for some reason. But when you look at it, you see all kinds of results out there. So I think one good way to kind of assess the literature is this meta-analysis I'm familiar with by Daniel Ballier that looked at the past 50 years of social dilemma research and looked for evidence of sex differences. And what they found is overall, kind of the big picture, there's no sex differences, especially not the kind that people often expect, where women are kinder and more cooperative than men. So we have some research that we conducted, my colleagues and I, on these bluffing games, bluff challenge games, where there's a strategic information communication between partners, and one has an option to communicate honestly or lie, and the other one can accept the communication or challenge it, and there's payouts that are affected by this. And what we found is that there were no sex differences in that research between the males and females' lies and challenges. But there is agreement among both genders about the kind of differences that they expect. And so we do see discrimination based on sex, but both males and females show the same discrimination. So basically both expected males to lie more and challenge more, and females to lie less and to accept the messages less. And so both males and females, when they were in the position of communicating a message, they would lie more to females, and they would challenge males more, because that was a more productive thing to do if the males are actually lying more.
So at least when it comes to dishonesty and mistrust, the gender stereotypes people hold are incorrect.
That's right. They're not correct. There's a lot of agreement on them. They seem to be pretty widespread. I mean, it's not just in our study in population. This has been shown cross-culturally, but at least with our data, or Dan Ballier's kind of assessment of the past 50 years of social dilemma research, they're not correct because there aren't these strong gender differences.
I'm not sure if this is something that you specifically studied, but would you have any idea as to where these gender stereotypes came from?
Well, there seems to be kind of these fuzzy stereotype concepts of males and females, of males being more agentic and females being more communal. And so the agency, maybe it's that it requires more agency to go out on a limb and lie and engage in that risk. And being more communal, this is probably attached to the nurturing relationship that adults have with offspring, which is strong among human females, stronger than males perhaps, that this communal aspect of female personality and identity kind of goes along with being more trusting and less challenging of others' behaviors and intentions. I'm just hazarding a guess. Where did these come from? I don't know. That's the best I can come up with.
Yeah, fair enough. So throughout our conversation regarding trust, you've talked about studies and specific games that you use in behavioral economics to study trust, the emotions associated with it, etc. Just before we move on to the last two topics or two questions, could you please give us a brief overview of what you think we can have a better understanding of regarding human interactions through these trust games?
Rephrase the question, the last part of it.
Yeah, I mean, what is it about human interactions that we can have a better understanding of through these trust games?
Okay, so trust games basically allow us to study how trusting people are and how people respond to trust. I don't know if I've explained enough about the trust game, or if I should elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, if you could elaborate a little bit more, please.
Sure. So, I mean, maybe I'll start with the most basic thing. What is a game? There's games of, on the field with balls and games of chance, but in the sense that we're talking about here, we're talking about a strategic interaction where people's decisions interact and create the results that they experience. And so there's trust games which maybe aren't monetary. Like there's this team building exercise called a trust fall. Someone stands on a chair with a stiff back and blindfolded or eyes closed and falls backwards, and their group mates catch them in their arms so that they don't crash into the ground and get hurt. That kind of has the elements of a trust game, even though there's no money involved, like the economic experiments. And also, people have described, like in non-human primates, there's these capuchins who have this high-risk eyeball poking tradition that Susan Fiske and others have described. Have you heard of this?
No, I don't think so.
It's really strange. So one capuchin will have its finger out, and they'll be sitting like two. They're usually closely affiliated individuals, and it'll stick its finger into the eye socket of the others, quite deep actually, and a dirty, sharp fingernail on there and everything. And so it's really risky. And the one receiving it is a willing partner, and sometimes the finger will pop out and they'll help kind of guide it back in. So I mean, we don't understand all the intentions behind this, but it has also features of the trust game. So the game that I've been making reference to, this kind of economic game in the laboratory, the type that behavioral economists like to use versions of came from the game that was described in 1995 by Joyce Berg, John Dickout, and Kevin McCabe. And in that game, there's two people paired with each other anonymously. One, the first player, let's call the investor, and the second player, the trustee. The investor gets $10 and can transfer any amount of it to the second player. That the experimenter triples that amount as it gets transferred, so that the second player gets the tripled income, $30 if they transfer the whole 10, for example. And then they decide what proportion of the tripled income to send back. Of the amounts that the investor doesn't send, they get to automatically keep. Of the amounts that the trustee doesn't send back, it's for the trustee to keep. And so, yeah, that is one way that we can study how trusting people are, how people respond to different levels of trust. And this game basically involves this voluntary taking on risk and kind of making yourself vulnerable as the first mover who demonstrates trust. And for the second mover who demonstrates trustworthiness, it requires some selflessness, some, helping out the first mover to act trustworthy and not exploit them. As I told you, we've been using also this game to understand how emotions are triggered and how they impact behaviors. There's other ways we've been using the game, or others have been also like changing the design of the game. One thing we did was we imposed some rules and regulations beyond what I described to you. So I have a study with Tom Reitz and colleagues, and there we were, what we did was we imposed minimum return rules for the second mover, the trustee. We had 4 versions of the game that we called R0, R10, R20, R30. The R0 is basically what I've already described. The R10 required the trustee to send back at least 10% of the tripled income. The R20 at least 20%, the R30 at least 30% of the tripled income. If it was 33, it would have guaranteed, if it was 33%, that would have guaranteed the investor no loss whatsoever. So that R30 was almost a guarantee of return on investment. It was just shy of it. But what we learned with this game is that those rules kind of backfire. Definitely the R10 and the R20 conditions, there was less trust and reciprocity. And what I mean by trust here is really, it's measured in terms of how much of your money is at risk that you're being transferred. The R30 worked pretty well for social welfare in terms of both participants earning money and neither coming out behind, but we see great behavior with no rules imposed. And so I thought that was a really cool study because it also tells us about, I think the take-home message is if trust is working, don't try to regulate ways to manage it. I mean, that's going to be costly anyway. If you have rules and regulations, someone needs to police violations, someone needs to enforce, what happens when you violate. But besides the costs of rules and regulations, they also seem to take away from people's willingness to go out on a limb and trust or act trustworthy. And so that take-home message, I think, could probably be applied to a lot of domains of society. And there's examples where we see that rules and regulations have gotten in the way of efficient behavior. Like if you think about traffic, there's been these traffic experiments in real life where intersections where there's congestion and accidents, they take out the traffic lights, which regulate behavior, and they remove signs, and they take paint off the street that has arrows and all this, and they have these kind of open circle areas. People have trouble adjusting to them at first, but the net effect is that it reduces, often, maybe not everywhere, it reduces congestion and the accidents go down. And they've also shown, like in some places like outdoor malls, they've combined streets into mixed use where people walk, bike, drive, and they've taken away signs. And this works well. It helps people kind of stop relying on the rules just mindlessly, and they start negotiating and almost bargaining with one another in a more careful way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, what are all or nothing approaches and where do they apply?
Right. So I mentioned this trust game, which has a continuous action space, meaning like the investor could choose any amount of their endowment to transfer. And when the trustee gets that income from the transfer, they can choose any amount to return. All or nothing trust games are the ones that have the more restricted or granular or extreme choice options. So for example, the investor, the first mover, would be given a choice only of going all in, investing everything, or nothing. That would be kind of an all or nothing option. So I have some research that compared these two different trust game designs. Timothy Shields, Joaquin Gomez-Miñamres, and I compared the all or nothing action space for investors to the continuous action space by running two versions of the trust game. Both gave the trustees the same kind of action space where they could return anything. But in one, it was an all or nothing investment. In the other one, it was whatever you want investment of the same endowment amounts. And what we found was that these all-in investors were reciprocated less generously in the all-or-nothing version than the ones who essentially invested everything, $10 in the continuous version. They got bigger returns on their investment. And we came up with some formal theory to explain how this is probably a result of the signaling that is possible with these alternative options. So when you could have invested a little bit less and you had a lot of freedom of how much to invest, investing that full amount is a more clear signal of trust. If you're someone who's kind of on the fence about, maybe if I had the choice, I would invest $6 out of $10, and now you have this all or nothing option, you might go with the all-in investment, though it wouldn't be your preference, right? And so the people who are receiving these investments, I think they can justify, maybe the guy wasn't fully trusting, and so they use that justification, I think, to send less. So that's indeed what we saw with our results. And we also had a kind of a second experiment that was part of this study where we then described what I just described, these two games that we had run, and said we have results on this, but we want to ask participants, how do they think about the intentions, about the kind of trust levels that people have in these different situations, which we described to them. So we asked them, how trusting would a hypothetical trustee who observed this $10 investment think the investor would actually be? And we gave them kind of like different levels of trust, from not at all trusting, somewhat trusting, mostly trusting, completely trusting. And what they told us was that the hypothetical trustee who saw that full investment in the continuous version, 97% of the people said that they would have thought it was a completely trusting investor. Now, the same amount invested in this all or nothing version, there was less agreement. We had 20% say, I think they're somewhat trusting, 40% said mostly trusting, and only 40% said completely trusting. So people weren't so sure that, it was really due to complete trust. We also asked a kind of a different version of that question. We said, what would someone of this level of trust invest? And so with that, not completely trusting, but the somewhat trusting, they told us that in the continuous version, somewhat trusting people would invest around $7, they guessed. And in the all or nothing, somewhat trusting would go up to the all in the $10. So it really kind of confirmed what our theory demonstrated and what our results of behavior demonstrated when we asked them to reveal their beliefs about these kind of scenarios.
Yeah. So one last topic then. What is the role, and perhaps this is also at least to some extent related to trust. What is the role that risk plays in the evolution of human exchange?
Sure. So, well, one explanation for what that role is drives from this larger theory of human evolution, where food sharing seems to have co-evolved with foraging strategies for acquiring these large, really nutritious food packages. Think like hunting large game. And so dietary strategy is linked to food sharing as a way to kind of buffer the risks that are associated with this large packaged food harvesting strategy. And we know from the ethnographic record from behavioral ecology that hunting among foragers shows really variable daily returns. For example, Ache foragers, when they go out hunting, it's most days they don't come back with food. I think it's like 43% of the time that they go out hunting, they'll come back with food. So, whatever, the 57% of the time they won't. The success rates are even lower with Hiwi foragers and even lower with Hadza foragers. Okay, so the generalization that at least we know from the ethnographic record is if you're depending on hunting large game, you'll have a lot of days where you don't have it. There's other reasons that you might not be successful. There's risk from illness or injury. You never know when some accident or illness will affect you. And Larry Sugiyama showed with Amazonian chiviar that from interviews, people reported that throughout their lifespan, they'd experienced multiple times that they had disability for long periods of time. Like a broken limb can lay someone out for a couple of weeks at least. And those periods of disability that were reported for most people, if they weren't provisioned by others, they probably wouldn't have survived. So basically, we have this risk buffering hypothesis because there's this intertemporal variance in large packaged food availability. There's an insurance mechanism that people have worked out behaviorally where successful foragers of those high variance resources will share their extra food with the unsuccessful foragers with the idea that when luck reverses itself, that the help will be returned reciprocally. And this works to effectively smooth the invariance in the return rates, and it allows people to have more efficient returns from this dietary strategy. But there's alternative hypotheses which have been strongly supported in the literature. One is the tolerated theft hypothesis, and this is the idea that those lucky possessors of things like food will tolerate others to take food or steal food from them because the cost to defending the food would exceed the value that they would get from keeping that food successfully. And also the value to the hungry individuals of that food is greater, so they've got a lot more motivation to put up a fight to get it. So that type of tolerated theft, some call it tolerated scrounging hypothesis, is the idea that it's this kind of what would determine transfers would be only the momentary invariance of who has and who doesn't have, whereas the risk buffering hypothesis entails reciprocity. And so actually, keeping track of the benefits perhaps that others have shown you in the past. The tolerated theft is more kind of a needs-based model. And related to that is the show-off hypothesis, which is the idea that people can accrue status by redistributing resources or just showing that they don't care when people come and take the resources. And so show-off hypothesis usually goes along with the idea that who would want this kind of status would be males who are interested in getting more mating success. And so that's another alternative explanation. And so with Hilly Kaplan and Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson, we designed a laboratory experiment to test these hypotheses. And it was based on a kind of almost like a video game type of computer experiment where people were in a virtual world and they were going about foraging and consuming food and potentially transferring food. They controlled these little avatars with their mouses. They would click somewhere on the screen, the avatar would go there. And so they went through kind of daily cycles where they would go out foraging at the beginning of this virtual day. They would choose either a high variance world that had occasional large packages, and sometimes those packages would run away and it was tricky to get them. And they could go to a low variance world that had small packages and they could get them with certainty. And they would kind of go into the foraging world individually. They would return to a central place, and then they would see what other people had acquired and have the opportunity to transfer resources to others. We didn't suggest that they should. We didn't explain anything about these hypotheses. But what we saw was that the people who went to that low variance world, they didn't seem to have interest in voluntarily transferring their resources. They didn't engage in sharing. People who went to the high variance world, however, they developed these reciprocal relationships and they voluntarily transferred their extra resources to others and then would return the favors. But that study was, I think, kind of cool, had some novel design features to it to test what people had just been looking at with kind of field data, which has its shortcomings as well. But it didn't really give a fair shake, I think, to the tolerated theft hypothesis because it didn't allow taking. We didn't design that into the game. We allowed giving, voluntary giving, but not the voluntary taking and kind of defending against takeaways. So we went back to the drawing board. We wanted to do an even better job. And we designed a second study that was pretty much like that first study, but now it also had this added feature where, like if I see you come back from your foraging and you've got a lot and I want to take something from you, I would click on your avatar. It would have a little drop-down menu for me, and I would indicate how many resources I would want to take from you. And as soon as I enter that, you and I would both see a kind of struggle. There was almost like a tractor beam that came out between the avatars, and it would be clear how much resources were attempted to be taken away, and you would see kind of per unit time these energy resources over the struggle would be consumed. And so if you were the one who was the defender, you would have a choice as soon as the struggle starts to either cede the resources, let me take them, or maintain the struggle. Same with me. If I realized you're putting up too much of a fight and I think I'm losing too much energy, I might want to, stop the struggle as well. And so what we saw was that at least initially, because there was multiple days and rounds of these interactions, that at least initially in this new study, people who came back without success from foraging did try to use the steal takeaway function initially, but they kind of learned through experience this wasn't the best way to go about things, and they probably saw that others were using an alternative strategy where they were working out reciprocal relationships. So over time, the stealing didn't persist, but what actually developed over time was these reciprocal exchange relationships. So that second study showed even stronger support for the risk buffering explanation because it kind of showed that there was non-support for those alternative explanations. And there weren't any big sex differences where males are allowing more taking versus females, which one might expect if there's some ingrained show-off propensity that's unique to males and not females, right, as suggested. But we didn't see that either.
So, beyond the studies you did, do you think that the risk buffering explanation is the best one out there, at least for now?
Um, yeah. So I think it's the best one in the sense of perhaps thinking about the challenges between individuals who aren't closely related genetically. And I mean, there's going to be complementary explanations as well for transfers, which kind of the discussion we started on, right? Intergenerational transfers of food resources and so on. So I would say the lion's share of sharing behavior that we observe, at least in small-scale foraging societies, would be best explained by inclusive fitness interest, kin investment. But in terms of human exchange phenomenon that we observe broadly, I mean, humans are, compared to all species that I'm aware of, we show the greatest breadth of how many different types of individuals we engage in exchange with. And we show great breadth in the types of exchanges that we develop with people. So explaining that, this kind of exchange with non-kin and so on, yeah, I think at least tentatively, this is my favorite hypothesis, the risk buffering one.
So, do you think that it would apply even more in larger scale societies where we tend to interact with even more anonymous people?
Well, to return to this concept of generalized trust, if the person that you're interacting with is someone you have no acquaintance with and no reputational information about, then you're going to have to take whatever your default mode of first engagement attitude is, right? And we see that in these societies with more anonymous interactions, people have more experience with trusting people that they don't know, right? But once those relationships are started, yeah, reputation, demonstration of cooperative trustworthiness, and so on are essential to maintaining those exchange relationships.
Great. So, Dr. Schniter, before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Oh, sure. So I have a Google Scholar page that it does a good job of listing publications, and I have a Google Sites personal web page, which also is another way that my publications and affiliations and other interests and so on are displayed. So those are two good ways to look me up. I'm sure maybe if I give you the links, you could post them later. Great.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you. It's been a great honor, and so glad I was able to do this.
Okay.
So glad I was able to do this.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this episode until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, starting at $1 per month. You also have links to PayPal. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Dennis Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf, Alex Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bert Arno Wolf, Tim Hollising, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Uniga, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Alec Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Gagey, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, and Sonny Smith. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanag, Dam Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Adriano, and Bogdan Kanivat. Thank you for all.